So today for Study Sunday, we got a little bit less of a study and a little bit more of a study. And this one's from Daniel Kahneman, who's pictured from his book, Thinking Fast and Slow here. In it, he talks about how he schooled some Israeli Air Force guys. Now, in the story, what he does is he talks about he's brought on as a consultant, and he's supposed to help them improve their training program. And they go to Daniel Kahneman, they're like, look, Daniel Kahneman, we figured out how to get these people to respond, how to get our pilots the most out of our pilots, and this is what we've discovered. You know, we don't praise them, and we only yell at them. And here's why. Every single time they perform really, really, really well, and then we praise them afterwards, they always perform worse. And then every time they perform poorly, and then we just rip into them, they always perform better afterwards. And so this is how we figured out, this is how you get the most out of them. Now, Daniel Kahneman, for those who are not aware of his background, he's a psychologist by trade, and he actually won a Nobel Prize in economics, which is a little bit rare. And he won it for understanding and doing a lot of exploration in economics in terms of cognitive biases, or stuff that makes people act not rational, because one of the assumptions of economics is that people act rational. And so what he told the Air Force was, you guys got it all wrong. What's actually happening is what's known as a regression to the mean. And so they're like, what are you talking about? And Daniel Kahneman's like, let me show you. All performance happens in what's known as a bell curve. You have really, really bad performances. You have really, really good performances. And most of your performances kind of just operate in the middle. And Daniel Kahneman's like, you know what happens when someone does really good? They're at the top end of their bell curve. And then you praise them. And then later they do come something around here. And when they do really, really poorly, and they're down here, and you yell them, and then later they come back to here. It's not actually, what you're yelling and you're praising is actually doing nothing. And what's really happening is what's known as a regression to the mean. And failure to recognize regression to the mean is a cognitive bias that Daniel Kahneman does talk about in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And what he says is, look, no matter what your performance is, afterwards, after you do your performance, you're very likely to just come back to like a normal looking performance for yourself. So after the exceptional performance, you're likely to come back here. And after the bad performance, you're going to come back here. And he's like, you know what, Air Force dudes, you got it wrong. And it's not that your yelling is especially effective and that praising is bad. It's that there's just a distribution curve of performance, and they will tend to perform in the middle of it regardless of what you do. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that, reinforcement or punishment is ineffective at all. This is a very far, a critically important thing in psychology is understanding that both punishment and reward are effective motivators. But what he's saying is, it's about this bell curve of performance. And so why I bring this up for Study Sunday, or just kind of like a little bit to talk about, is I think that this is profoundly good for just thinking about how correlation doesn't equal causation. I think it's a really good example of correlation not equaling causation, because what the Israeli Air Force did is they correlated their behavior, either yelling at the pilot or praising the pilot. They correlated their behavior with the pilot's performance, when in fact their behavior was not a cause of the pilot's performance. They thought that their praising the pilot made them perform worse, and they thought that their yelling at the pilot made them perform better. And this is just a critical thing for understanding information, is that as far as performance goes, or whenever you're thinking about performance, you want to think about there being kind of like an average performance, and on average, you're going to perform average. So for example, in weightlifting, your very, very best, even if you hit a new max or a new PR, you're very likely to not be able to repeat that performance, because that's one of these things. And so you shouldn't get mad at yourself when your performance kind of comes back to here and you can't do that spectacular performance. And so it's critical for not beating yourself up, but also being aware that your performance happens in a bell curve can help you in other ways, such as making you focus on, back here, sometimes you got to try and bring up your bad performances and have them be a little bit better. And this is what's known as the Inchworm model of self-improvement, although there isn't that many places to find information on it. And just to kind of talk about correlations a little bit more, there's this very funny website called tylervigan.com where they feature some spurious correlations. So some correlations between two data points or two series of data where they have an almost near perfect correlation that they happen in terms of the events, but there's no relationship in terms of causation. So just thinking back to the Israeli Air Force stuff, there should be some sort of, effect of whether or not they yell on them or praise them in terms of performance, but for the most part, they're also just going to regress to the mean. For these spurious correlations, there's no relationship, no causal relationship. U.S. spending on science, space, and technology correlates with suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation. The number of people who drowned by falling in a pool correlates with films Nicolas Cage has starred in. And the point is not that these two events are somehow related. It's that very often you can get data that looks very similar to other data in terms of trajectory, and it makes it look like they might be related, but they can be completely unrelated. My personal favorite is the per capita cheese consumption correlates nearly perfectly with the number of people who have died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Is the point that they are being killed by their cheese consumption because they are increasingly being tangled in their bed sheets? No, that's extremely unlikely. But there's a 94% correlation. And so very often, we have a tendency to think of our own behavior and how our own behavior is influencing events, just like these Air Force training personnel. And we fail to recognize other stuff like a regression to the mean and how other people's performance, will just tend to come back to the mean, or even our own performance. We get caught up in rituals regarding our own performance and fail to recognize, when we hit a max and we're like, oh, I ate Skittles in that morning, so now I'm going to eat Skittles, and it's really just we hit one of these by magic, and we'll have a regression to the mean, and just kind of understanding that can kind of help to better prepare yourself, and also prepare yourself for interacting with others. Like, let's say you have a really nice interaction with your girlfriend or whatever, and maybe she's just in a spectacular mood, something that doesn't have anything to do with you. And then, she just has a regression to the mean in terms of mood, and you think it's some sort of behavior you engaged in here. These sorts of things will help you kind of evaluate information, and just being aware, as Daniel Kahneman might say, that you can regress to the mean. Anyways, I hope this was a little bit interesting. I'm going to be trying to start getting into the study Sundays a little bit more effectively. Obviously, this wasn't a study. This was an anecdote. But I think it is a good one because we are trying to think of how to evaluate information kind of in the context of the study. Okay, we're mainly talking about psychology studies here, but just kind of evaluating information is one of the things you do in any type of, examining studies. And so we're talking about here how correlation doesn't always equal causation. Another really good example of this is how nutrition studies, for example, will often they'll often correlate with obesity in America going up, but they won't have a structured experimental design study. And, so for example, people are extremely healthy who tend to be vegan or vegetarian or these types of things. But there's also other factors. And so when you have spurious correlations, there can be other things involved. In the case of the anecdote of Kahneman and the Israeli Air Force, talking about this regression to the mean, the third thing that was important, was that there was just a regression to the mean, and this was failed to be recognized by the Air Force pilots who just thought it had to entirely with whether or not they yelled or praised at the pilots. And so very often in nutrition, making a full circle, vegetarians and vegans tend to be very healthy, but people who choose to be vegetarian or vegan tend to be healthier in general, and most dietary studies are correlational. And so you get the people who are more health conscious, more likely to exercise, and more likely to these things, and they're more likely to have a self-selection bias into these vegan or vegetarian groups. Now, I'm not trying to make an argument about veganism or vegetarianism. What I'm trying to say is that very often we'll evaluate correlational data, because almost all nutritional data is correlative, because it's almost impossible to get a large cohort to adhere to a very specific diet and also be sure that they're adhering. And as a consequence, the information is like not very good. And understanding this like correlation versus causation problems can, help to kind of evaluate these sort of things in a substantive way, or also just like kind of have asterisks next to your understanding where you're holding in your mind, this could be the case, but the information might not be good. It's based on correlation, not causation. There could be other factors, these types of things. Anyways, I hope this was interesting. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe. If you have a specific study in mind that you think should be covered, feel free to link it in the comments, and have a good day.